You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show discussing legal and tax issues associated with prairie fires. And to talk about it, we're joined by K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Roger, are there often a lot of legal and tax issues associated with prairie fires?
Oh, there sure are. And some of these people that have recently been hit with these prairie fires were hit about 8 years ago out in the Ashland area, and it's just devastating for them. But fortunately, the tax code and state law also has some helpful provisions when you have disasters like this that occur.
I'm going to talk through a few of those different options and provisions. First one involving forced sale rules, and how does this matter to a producer?
Well, when you have wildfires that destroy grazing land, you might find yourself in a situation where you have to sell cattle early because there's just no pastures left to graze them on, or no rangeland, at least temporarily, until things grow back. And the tax code does have two primary mechanisms to manage the resulting tax spike, because, again, if you're going to sell excess livestock more than you normally would in that particular tax year, that could generate some additional income and bump you up into a higher tax bracket. So one of the tools is that you can use a one-year deferral rule. If you're on the cash method of accounting, you can make an election to defer the income from your livestock sold in excess of the normal business practice for that year. And as long as the area is designated for federal assistance, whether by the president or by the Secretary of Agriculture due to the fire, you can qualify for this. But again, deferral only applies to the number of heads sold above your 3-year average.
What's the other option?
Well, the other option is known as the involuntary conversion rule. So if you have draft, dairy, or breeding animals, not feeder calves, you can defer the gain entirely if you replace the livestock within a specific time frame. And generally that's 2 years, but it's 4 years if the area gets a federal disaster designation, and I'm sure this will. And if that area would continue to experience drought, for example, or some type of event that's linked to the wildfire risk, that period can get extended beyond 4 years. So the IRS will often link drought to wildfire risks if the fire destroyed forage, effectively creating a drought-like lack of feed. So basically 4 years to replace, but it could be extended further.
So when it comes to replacing these animals, if they sold a replacement female, do they need to replace that replacement female with the same thing?
That's right. They have to be functionally similar. That's a good point. So you've got to replace breeding cows with breeding cows. You can't use the proceeds to, for example, to buy a tractor.
And another big thing when we're thinking about fires and destruction, fences, and what are some tax issues with that?
You may have wooden posts that have been destroyed, so your fences have been destroyed. Now, I am aware that in the Ashland area that was burned a number of years ago, that some of the ranchers there replaced with steel posts, and so they'll have less of a damage with respect to fences. But it does create some issues from a tax standpoint, because a lot of these fences, Shelby, have been depreciated out. So you put up a new fence as a result of the fire 7 or 8 years ago, and you maybe bonused that out, or you took Section 179, but whatever you did, or maybe even standard maker's depreciation under 7-year rules, and you don't have any basis left in that fence. So if the fire destroys the fence and you don't have any income tax basis in it, then your deductible tax loss is zero, and your expenses paid to replace the damaged fence cannot be deducted as a current loss. And so the only deduction that you would claim in that situation is what you haven't already written off through depreciation. But my guess is that's going to be very low or non-existent. And any reconstruction of a fence that's been entirely destroyed by fire, IRS is going to say that's a capital improvement. That's not a repair. And so you don't get a current deduction for the rebuild. It's going to be added to the fence's basis and then depreciated out over time. Now, if it's a minor fix, so maybe I'm replacing a few burnt posts, those are deductible in the current year as an ordinary business expense. You're going to have to make that distinction, but we can offset the immediate cost of a destroyed fence with the ramp up in Section 179 under the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or now we've got 100% bonus depreciation again.
How does insurance play into this?
Well, if you got insurance on a destroyed or damaged fence, if those proceeds exceed your basis, that's going to trigger gain. So again, we go back to Probably these fences don't have any income tax basis in it. And if you get insurance proceeds for that, that's all going to be taxable gain. But that gain might be avoided by treating the destruction as an involuntary conversion and then simply reinvesting the insurance proceeds into the new fence.
If a building was destroyed, how does that play into property value and impact producers?
Well, if we've got a business property such as a ranch, you're going to have to calculate the loss for each unit. And typically, the IRS will look at this as a single identifiable property, or a SIP, as we call it. And that's the specific tract of land that's affected. So in the case of a ranch, the land and the improvements, meaning they're the fences and corrals, they're often treated as separate, single identifiable properties. So the taxpayer has to compare the land's adjusted basis with the decline in the fair market value of the property. And then the deduction is the lesser of those two numbers.
How does that impact then what it might be appraised for?
That's another really good question. Valuing scorched land will require an appraisal. And so that appraiser is going to look at what a willing buyer would pay for scorched earth versus healthy pasture. And often that value is going to drop because the buyer can't run cattle on it for 1 to 2 growing seasons. And so sometimes the cost of the repairs, so I mean reseeding or erosion control or debris removal, those costs can be used as a proxy for the decline in the fair market value. But the IRS will only allow that if the repairs are necessary to restore the land to its pre-casualty condition and the amount that you spend is not excessive.
How do they identify what is necessary?
Let's say that you've got an appraiser that determines a fire caused, for example, a $200,000 decline in value, but the tax basis in land is $50,000. So there you're going to get a maximum tax deduction of $50,000. You're not going to get the full $200,000 loss that's incurred. Now, what's necessary to restore the land? That's often going to be tied into those numbers. So what is necessary to bring the land back to its pre-casualty condition? That's how we're going to determine whether that's excessive or not. And again, measuring the decline in the value tied to the tax basis is one way we figure out what is reasonable.
How does that then impact property taxes?
Well, again, and Kansas and Oklahoma have 2 different provisions on this. And the fire, of course, started in Oklahoma and came into Kansas. Federal income tax is tied to basis, but state property tax is tied to productivity. And that's particularly the case in Kansas. Kansas values ag land based on productivity potential, not market value. So if you've got a fire that's destroyed the landlord's share of net income, for example, then the county appraiser can be petitioned, and in Kansas that has to be by April 15, for a valuation adjustment. Now, Oklahoma, they have a constitutional cap on how much a property's assessed value can increase, and that's 3 to 5% annually. So if the fire causes the market value to drop below the capped value, property taxes in Oklahoma should decrease proportionally.
What other options are available potentially for producers?
Well, the USDA's got a number of programs involving disaster assistance. They've got the livestock indemnity program that's going to provide payment for livestock deaths that exceeded normal mortality rate that were caused by the fire. There's the emergency assistance for livestock program, or ELAP. That'll cover the cost of hauling water or feed to livestock and the cost of transporting livestock to new grazing land. Then there's the Emergency Conservation Program, or ECP. That provides funding to repair fences and water facilities that were destroyed by the fire. So as long as you've got good, reliable records of your livestock deaths and the casualty that was caused, and you've got photos and veterinary certifications or maybe rendering plant receipts, that's all going to be helpful when it comes to these government programs. But failure to document your losses immediately can lead to legal denials of the claim. So you got to be diligent and make sure you keep good records and keep good photo evidence of what happened to you with respect to the fire.
So as we're looking at all this, what are your key takeaways for producers?
Well, the key takeaways are that I think there are a lot of technical tax issues that farmers and ranchers are going to have that were affected by the fire on their 2026 tax return. So as I mentioned, keeping good evidence of what you went through and understanding how to handle repair costs and what is deductible and what is not, so that you can project your cash flow and your financial needs. And so you need to be talking to your tax professionals now on that side of things. And then, of course, you've got liability and property law issues. If animals that survived the fire now are wandering around because the fences were destroyed, again, the rule in Kansas as well as in Oklahoma is you're not going to necessarily be liable if there's an accident because somebody hits them out on the road. the injured party is going to have to prove that you were negligent somehow. And that's going to be an uphill climb for an injured party in this type of situation, this type of a disaster. You weren't negligent in having your animals get out. It was something that was beyond your control. And then keep in mind any state-specific incentives. There are some state incentives to knock off state sales tax for repairing materials used to repair fences, those types of things. So lots of things to think about. And I would say, again, emphasizing talk to your tax professionals, make sure they're aware of what you've gone through, and so they can get you some projections as to how this might affect your cash flow, depending on what the tax provisions are that you want to utilize on your 26 return.
Roger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
That was K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. I will link a blog article on this topic in today's show notes on agtoday.net if you'd like to read more.